Right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Joe Eggers. I'm the Interim Director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and I want to welcome you all to today's program. It's my honor to introduce today's speaker, Orly Friedman. He's an associate professor at the Belgrade-based Faculty of Media and Communications, where she heads the Center for Comparative Conflict Studies. She's also the academic director of the School for International Training Learning Center in Serbia. Her recent book, Memory, Activism and Digital Practices After Conflict, Unwanted Memories, was published by Amsterdam University Press in 2022 and will be discussed today. She's the author of scholarly articles and chapters on memory politics, peace studies, online and on-site commemoration, and civic activism with a focus on Western Balkans and Israel-Palestine. Her forthcoming co-edited volume will be published with Palgrave this year and is titled The COVID-19 Pandemic, A New Memory Era, Remembrance, Commemoration, and Archiving in Crisis. Following Orly will be Nika Strimak, a fourth-year PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Minnesota. Nika studies gender, social movements, and collective memory of the Yugoslav wars in Serbia. Following Nika's response, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions to both Orly and Nika, and I ask that you please use the Q&A function in the Zoom to pose your questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Orly. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Joe, for the invitation and organizing this event today. And of course, thank you so much, Nika, for inviting me to join the center and conversation with you that I was looking forward to have this evening, or my evening time. And so let me share my screen first and I'll get started. And so what I will share with you today, I think in the first half hour of our time together, is insights from my book that is titled Memory, Activism and Digital Practices After Conflict, Unwanted Memories. And this is actually, for me, work that spans over approximately 2 decades of various stages of research that I've conducted in Serbia, in the Balkans, an opportunity to really observe carefully and think about memory politics, memory activism, and the practices of those human beings who actually labor with the past. Maybe so in the first part of my presentation today, I'd like to go over some of the frameworks that I put forward and try to advance in terms of our thinking in memory studies and also in peace studies. And then I'll just share as much as I can empirical evidence and insights from my work and for what I discuss in the book. But I'd like to start with just a few words of my own positionality as I enter my inquiries of dealing with what I explore in this book as unwanted memories of difficult pasts. And I'm always interested in authors' own background, where they come from, how do we come to our topics, to the questions that we ask, and very much in memory studies also, what are the memory landscapes or memoryscapes we ourselves come from to our research. And so in my own background, I grew up in Israel, and in the memory landscape in Israel, I would say there were 2 main issues very much sort of defining our thinking and engagement with the past. And one was Never Again, and the whole engagement with the memory of the Jewish Holocaust in the political lives in Israel, and of course as it shaped also issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The other thing that very much shaped our engagement or lack of engagement with the past had to do with the concealed history of 1948 and the Palestinian Nakba, the expulsion of approximately 750,000 Palestinians from what has become the state of Israel. And so in many ways, these kind of my own memoryscapes have led me to a number of questions that kind of define my inquiry and my in this book and in the presentation today. Try to engage and ask what are the ways in which the social organization of memory shape processes of our societal engagement with difficult pasts. And with difficult pasts, I refer to issues of from post-dictatorship communities or post-genocide or post-war. And in this engagement with difficult past, I ask questions about mostly silences and cases where there's what we see societal level of denial of past atrocities. I'm also interested to engage with the question of what is the role of memory activists and of alternative commemorative events in processes of the construction of the past, especially after violent conflicts and war. And finally, I'm interested to kind of engage critically with the question of the role of memory activism in generating civic engagement, empathy, and even hope after conflict, which I will speak a little bit about in the next slide when I present the framework. So in many ways, I chose to conduct my research and engage with my inquiries in places where weren't my own memory landscape, and took the position, at least when I started, a little bit as an outsider, which allowed me at the time to ask, I believe, some more questions. And so to start, I'd like to put forward some of the frameworks that I've proposed and developed in the book. And so first, I'm interested in the study of memory activism and their mnemonic practices that I analyzed throughout the book, as can be traced through alternative commemorative events and alternative calendars. Now, analyzing alternative calendars, of course, requires that we first engage and analyze the state-sponsored calendars. And in the case of Serbia, which I developed in the book, actually, it's a very interesting process because it's still ongoing, the design of the post-Yugoslav calendar, if you want, or the newer calendar of the state of Serbia. I'm also interested in the establishment of network of what I call, and other scholars I borrow from, commemorative solidarity, allowing political acknowledgement, camaraderie, and alternative venues to politics of victimization. And those of us who work on conflict studies, peace studies, are very well aware of to what extent politics of victimization is dominant in so many societies that emerge from conflict, and even the competition over victimization. And I propose to think about alternative commemorative events as platforms to create commemorative solidarity between societies and, of course, activists who advance that. Memory activism and memory of activism I approach as a very vibrant arena for the study of political struggles and dissent, the study of civic activism, agency, as well as empathy. There was a body of literature about politics of disappointment in Serbia in the aftermath of what came after the wars, and I actually tried to enter a dialogue with that through thinking also of possibilities for politics of hope, trying to advance memory activism and memory of activism as anti-denial work, as a strand of anti-war or peace activism, and very much of civic resistance. As the title of the book suggests, I also devote an entire chapter to analyze digital practices and online commemoration and commemorative events through the framework of hashtag memory activism, which I will speak a bit more about in a number of slides. And finally, I try to think of memory activism not only as happening on the national level or local level, but as a strand of regional activism, which kind of insists on going beyond ethnicity only. And so I propose to think about the region of the post-Yugoslav successor states actually as a region of memory and region of memory activism. In the title, I also suggest that we need to, the way I understand the analysis of the memories of the 90s or the wars of the 90s in Serbia, which is sort of at the center of my inquiry in this book, I came to understand those as unwanted memories. And actually, I borrowed these from some of the activists themselves who feel that their efforts to kind of push forward certain questions otherwise silenced or denied in their communities are extremely unwanted. And as such, their actions themselves. For those of you, for example, from the United States or from other places listening to us, think of your own societies, calendars, alternative calendars, what is not on the calendar and what could constitute an unwanted memory in terms of engagement, societal engagement with difficult pasts and difficult memories. And so to kind of allow us to enter a little bit that space that I'm talking about, the post-Yugoslav space or the successor states of the former Yugoslavia, just 2 slides for those of us maybe a little bit less familiar with the region itself. In my study, I focus on the unwanted memories of the wars of the 90s in Serbia, and then very much connect Serbia to the entire region, which we can call the post-Yugoslav space. And the wars of the 90s, which Serbia was involved in all of them, actually raise a number of challenges when it comes to legacies of, say, war crimes and questions of their responsibility. And in many ways, I also argue that those questions cannot be understood only of the level of one of those states in isolation from the others. And hence we have the region itself, which now consists of 7 states, successor states. 6 of them are with UN membership. The 7th, Kosovo, is still struggling to get that UN seat and membership, right? So it has some of these contestations that I speak about also have to do with that. 2 of those 7 are already EU member states, Slovenia and Croatia, while Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, Kosovo, and Northern Macedonia are still in different stages of candidacy or lack of in joining the European Union. The legacies of the Yugoslav wars of the 90s can be discussed in another talk, probably in length. I'd like to highlight just a number. We speak about major changes in borders that, of course, generate changes of identities, less mobility between those states. The number of the human losses are important because these are part of the contestations that still occur today, 3 decades after the wars of the 90s. Massive displacement both of refugees and internally IDPs. The question of missing people is still very much open in the whole region. Profound demographic change from multi-ethnicity, I would say, to cities and towns and villages that are more homogenic in terms of ethnicity, economic devastation and decline. And for me, the most interesting and important thing to analyze memory activism and alternative commemoration is the last one, which we see in all the region, but predominantly, I would say, in Serbia, nationalist and exclusionary discourses, discourses and practices of denial of war crimes, of political responsibility, very much politics of victimization, and in the entire region, massive engagement with historical revisionism. And so in many ways, memory activists in this region, this is their entry point, if you want, in terms of their labor of looking forward in order to actually make claims for a better and more peaceful future. If you want to think about the region and how this last point manifests itself in today's everyday politics, very much in the city of Belgrade, we have plenty of graffiti and murals, if you want. And this mural kind of exemplifies my point in many ways of some of the mnemonic battles and interpretations of the past as we see them today. This mural on the left is of Ratko Mladic, who was the military leader of the army of Republika Srpska in Bosnia-Herzegovina during the war. He was convicted for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in the ICTY. And this mural actually appeared in the very center of Belgrade in the summer, of 2021, after Mladic's final appeal was rejected. And any attempts to remove this mural were actually ended up in failure. In November 21, it became actually a flashpoint of the conflict between those who see Mladic as a war hero and those who see him as a war criminal, when the Belgrade-based Youth Initiative for Human Rights called upon citizens in the city to gather on November 9th, the International Day Against Fascism and Anti-Semitism, to remove the mural from the wall and clean it up. And as you can see, there were attempts afterwards, so they were stopped and they were not able to clean the wall by those who kind of defended that mural, those who see Mladic as a war hero. And there were various attempts maybe to kind of throw paint or kind of engage with the mural, but it still stands. It still stands today with many other plenty of graffiti around the city. Now, this whole event happened after I finished my book and after I completed it, but it sort of exemplifies some of the arguments that I'm analyzing, showing, and the engagement and the challenges of memory activism in a space of unwanted memories and sort of inability to engage openly with some of the questions of the past. Now, the main frame that I propose in the book, or methodologically speaking, I would say, is that I analyze memory activism through the analysis of the nuances of the generational mnemonic claims. So, and the way those memory activists are positioned as their claims as counter memories and counter arguments from below. And I trace actually the changes that occur between the generations of memory activists and also their practices. And so in this image, you can see what I call the first generation of memory activists, mostly the group of the generation of the women in black and other actors who were actually during the 90s anti-war activists or peace activists. And they turn into memory activists only after the end of the Milosevic regime, or even more so after the assassination of the Serbian Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić in 2003. Their slogan during the 90s as well as after was "Not in my name." They have the living memories of these wars, and they stand against other issues such as militarism, They have a feminist framing of their actions and of their claims. And as I show in the book, they actually they're the creators of what I call the kind of civic alternative calendar of Serbia today. And on one of the main events on that calendar, so the calendar actually commemorate events from the wars of the 90s and the victims of those events that are often either dehumanized or sort of unrecognized in Serbia. And one of the main events is the July 1995 genocide in Srebrenica, which they commemorate every year in the Republic Square, the main square in Belgrade. As you can see, it has elements of the performativity as they engage with passersby, and most of their actions are actually modeling after the Israeli women in black. These are silent vigils where they send a certain message of remembering, acknowledging the victims of genocide, yet not interacting with passersby and their comments. The continuation of this methodological inquiry of the different generations, then I come to what I call the second generation of memory activists in Serbia. And here I mostly analyze the group of the Youth Initiative for Human Rights in Serbia, and it also has its branches in the entire region. And here you can already see the change, for example, in the slogan. They no longer can relate to the slogan of the first generation, "Not in my name," and they actually came up with their own slogan that reads, "Too young to remember, determined never to forget." And many of the members of this second generation, say born in the 90s, or maybe right after the wars, don't necessarily have living memories of the events of the 90s, yet they feel these were given to them as the legacies of these years, hence their commitment and what they say, their responsibility to engage with these issues openly in the society. And as you can see in the image from one of their actions on July 11th to commemorate again the genocide in Srebrenica, they take some of the symbols that the women in black are using the day before. The women in black on July 11th always travel to Potocari, to Bosnia-Herzegovina, where there is the central commemorative event there to the victims of Srebrenica. And they say we need to stay in Serbia, in Belgrade at that time, and keep this memory and these claims alive. And what I show is some of the change in their practices is that they are offering a little bit more interactive events with passersby, and also, as you can see in this image, for example, placing the numbers on the floor as to show the number of the victims from these crimes committed in 1995. I continue then to open up the question that otherwise is seen as a little bit what civil society here would call buried under layers of silences. And this is sort of my attempt to engage with, or to analyze the way memory activists engage with memory work in relation to the war in Kosovo. And as you can see, what I analyze here are new commemorative practices, but also artworks and other practices beyond commemorations, only, as I said, some artwork, but also memory walks. And I'll also speak about memory activism. As you can see in the image that I chose to share, this is a commemorative event took place in 2019, where activists remember Albanian victims from one of the massacres in Suva Reka, which was committed in March 99. And 744 victims from a number of massacres in those months, when these are the months of the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia at the time. 744 people or remains of victims were unearthed in a mass grave in the outskirts of Belgrade, which is called Batajnica. And then the activists are actually sort of claiming this buried truth. These mass graves were found in 2001, and since then have entered kind of layers of silence in the society. As I mentioned, I also analyze some artwork, and I, among other things, I look at two films by the film director Ognjen Glavonic from Serbia. On the left, you can see his film from 2017. It's a documentary film, Depth 2, which deals with the issues in Batajnica, in the mass graves, as I mentioned in my former slide, as well as his 2018 film, The Load, which also kind of tells the story of those concealed crimes from the war in Kosovo. And interesting enough, the title of the film in Serbian is called Teret, and Teret can be translated to the load, but also to the burden, right? And he very much sort of engages in a very interesting way with these burdens of the past as the load of on today's society in Serbia and in the region. There's other practices as in the inability to put a plaque next to those mass graves that were identified, or to build a site of memory. Activists go online and create a sort of online commemorative spaces, if you want. We can talk more about it maybe later on. And also I analyze another group of activists from the Center for Public History, who actually started engaging also with memory work in the form of memory walks. And they take sort of people to some of those places of mass graves or mass crimes, to kind of inform people, which is at the heart of what memory activism claims to do, which is the production of alternative knowledge, or knowledge or engagement, and the sort of moving forward knowledge that otherwise is silenced or denied. And very much through my work, through the sort of analysis of the different generations and the way they engage with the past, I also came to engage with parts of what Anne Rigney addresses as the memory activism nexus, and the way actually memory activists, the younger memory activists, began to engage in what I see here as memory of activism. So they go back to remember the legacies, for example, of the anti-war activists that took place in the 90s, and that's very often in an environment where, for example, war criminals are being celebrated, and then the younger memory activists are actually looking for their own heroes, right? And they go back to sort of dig into the legacies of the memory and the memories of activism to speak about and promote their own heroes, if you want, because those heroes are not seen in any of the public spaces of the cities here. They don't get street names after them, or schools names, or names of main squares in the city. So this is something I found myself sort of elaborating on extensively in the book as well. The framework that I suggest, actually, I propose as a framework to approach and study digital memory activism and online commemoration is what I call the hashtag memory activism. And there's plenty of work on hashtag memory, and I try to kind of advance that to look at the hashtag as a mnemonic tactic that enables and even strengthens the creation of alternative platforms for remembrance through sharing and disseminating of alternative knowledge about contested pasts, on online and on social media. And this is, of course, methodologically very interesting. How do we approach social media as sites for our own research these days? And what I did in the 4th chapter in the book is actually, I chose 4 hashtags, as you can see here on the left, and treat each one of them as a case study that I analyze and sort of choose to engage critically with, from hashtags of banned commemorations, as happened on the 20th anniversary of commemoration of Srebrenica, to the hashtag Not Our Heroes. It's kind of a generational mnemonic claim that I analyze also as part of my understanding of the region as a region of memory. And just for the lack of time, I'll maybe also add, I'll jump to this hashtag, It Did Happen, which actually, the image here, it was the image that was chosen by the activists to put on a website they created, which is called Rat u Srbiji, or War in Serbia, where they actually disseminate knowledge about the wars of the 90s, the engagement of Serbia, and also about the war, the anti-war activists in this time, and very much as sort of acts of silence breaking, which I analyze through their online platform, which also has elements of archival work, digital work that they have done in their action. And finally, my last chapter, as I mentioned, is actually approaching the region of the post-Yugoslav region as a region of memory, and more specifically, region of memory activism. And in the entire region, despite of the prevalence of ethno-national forms of engagement with the legacies of the 90s, I actually show how emerging platforms where activists claim agency through alternative counter memories also allow them kind of civic engagement, and also to advance our understanding of memory activism as transcending the national, and also facilitating the articulation of regional mnemonic claims that go beyond ethnicity. And so, as I show here, just took different various snapshots from the Women's Court, which kind of has claims the feminist approaches to deal with the legacies of, let's say, the legal work that was done in the ICTY, or the critique of the lack of the feminist approaches there to think about justice, to actions like historians against revisionism, who kind of bring forward the question who started first, and they fight against growing tendencies of revisionism in the region, or RECOM, the Reconciliation Network, that also works on a regional level. And so I think I will end with that, my part, and I'll pass it on to you, Nika, and I look forward to hear your comments and thoughts. And I guess I'll stop sharing my PowerPoint now, right?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Orly, for that presentation. That was really, really clear and insightful and helpful for me personally, and super interesting summary of the book. And I know we have some questions, and Susan, I see your hand up as well, and maybe we can, I don't know if it's possible for people to also maybe just come off of mute or something and ask their questions in a few minutes. So I will see if you'd like to do that in a second, Susan. I mean, I have a lot of questions myself and thoughts. I think this book is incredibly important contribution to the field of memory studies and to the study. I think, as you pointed out, bringing together this study of social movements and memory, this like memory movement nexus, in these couple of different strands of that nexus of memory of movements, I think, is incredibly powerful as well, to raise awareness of those previous examples of activism that can really demonstrate to people the power of collective action and civil action and civil resistance. And then also the movements about memory, movements about collective memory, and even this third strand too about memory in other types of movements, just bringing together those these sort of disparate fields of study is an incredible, I think, contribution of your book. And I just think the example of women in Black and also this generational dimension of the second generation of activists is just such an incredible example for me. And I think it's fascinating because that society, for anyone who's familiar with it, is so there's so much exclusion and lack of sort of pluralism and lack of kind of democratic politics in general still. And lack of conversation about the wars and about Serbia's role in the wars. And so what they are doing is really remarkable. And I think that was clear in your presentation, and it's very clear in the book. And it's inspiring for other contexts of instances where there is such public silencing and forgetting and lack of discourse around these topics and difficult memories. And I also finally think that, well, two other things that I think are important to highlight. One is the element of cultural activism and performance and theater and all of the art. And we can see that in some of the photos that you showed, and everything I think ties to other global examples of kind of this cultural activism in Latin America, in South Africa, in North America as well. That is really powerful, I think, in opening up possibilities for people to engage with these memories and to have sort of an open-ended process of engagement rather than sort of a top-down presentation of this is what happened, but this element of, you know, dialogue and interpretation that people can have that I think is really impactful. One question that I often get asked is about sort of the broader impacts of their activism, which I know is kind of it's important. Their work, what they're doing is so remarkable just for the presence of this knowledge that they are putting forth and their presence on the streets and so on. But do you have any insight into, and I've been doing in my own research some interviews and focus groups, as you know, with like ordinary people too, about their memories and their narratives about the wars. But yeah, has there been any, could you speak a little bit about some of the public reaction or participation in this memory activism, or are they having, do you think that they are having some positive effects on the general public knowledge about the wars in Serbia?
Yeah, thank you, Nika. This is a big question. I think we also had a chance to discuss that probably earlier on. I would say a few things here. As we see in many places in the world, and today we have divisions that run very deep in almost all societies and all places where it comes to not only struggles about the past, but also struggles about democracy and other issues as we see today, for say, through the issues of the illiberal turn, for example, that we see in many societies, including the United States, right? These are sometimes divisions that run very deep between different actors and activists themselves in the society. In what I understand, the role of memory activism. And, you know, memory activism can also be utilized and practiced by the far right or by right wingers, right? So I didn't have enough time to speak about it, but in fact, I'm interested in those practices and this activism when its aim is to promote more equality, justice, and peace, but it can also be used in many other ways. And so particularly in Serbia, we know, I mean, we cannot argue, but that the position of these actors who are dealing with these issues openly and pushing them into the public discourse and the public space, if you want, is quite marginal, right? They're not supported by big segments of the society. And as I said, what they bring on to the discussion is those unwanted memories when we speak about the 90s, for example, right? And by the way, the 90s has memories in Serbia that don't only deal with the wars, they also deal with the Milosevic regime and what happened to the societies during his days in power, to economic decline, to hyperinflation, to loss of dignity, right? So many other issues that they're also bringing as memories of this year. So I think they do, and they did, and we see it now in the way it moves on to the next generation. They created this civic platform for remembrance, and they do the commemorative events and commemorations and the calendar. But built on that, we see other practices from those that we see on the digital sphere to other street actions and street practices, right? So I think this is their legacy, the foundation of civic action and the creation of civil society in Serbia throughout these years of the 90s. And some of the practices still stand today, right? They continued and have their own life, and these groups are also still active. And I would say the other thing, two more things. One is that you can see how today in Serbia, I would already argue that it's easier to engage with activism about the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was not the case, say, 15 or 20 years ago, while the issues of Kosovo are now those that are sort of much harder to conceal and sort of bring up from their silence, layers of silence and denial, and also the way it plays itself out in everyday politics today in Serbia. So that's one thing I see, and I think it has to do with the rituals and the fact that these practices happen every year on the same day. They did create some awareness and knowledge of these issues. Again, it doesn't run very broad, but it has claimed, I think, some civic space. And the other thing is that, again, what we see in many societies today, the way the space for activism is shrinking, for liberal activism, for, in this sense, memory activism, critical engagement with the past, and they're maintaining that space. And with their absence, there will be no claims at all, and no labor that will be done in thinking critically about these pasts. And I mean, I think the extreme case of that, what we see is maybe in places like today's Russia, when civil society was erased. I mean, and either went to exile or had to go silent completely with the politics of fear and all these issues. So I think maintaining this space alive in Serbia today, where also democracy is in question, is a major challenge for activists in these groups today as well.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask one other question, and then I have a question from Joe from the center as well that I will raise. And anyone else, please feel free to also raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or type it into the chat. I think that this idea the idea that you raise about the idea of hope is really helpful for me and inspiring in the book. And because that is just, it's often, we're talking about commemorating difficult memories and, you know, this really negative, difficult process. And so the idea that that through commemoration, we can actually begin to generate hope and sort of reconciliation between groups and so on, and is really inspiring. And another innovation about creating a region of memory in the Balkans and sort of a shared memory is really inspiring. One question that I'm wondering if you talk about the effects that this memory activism and this creating a region of memory can have in sort of promoting sustainable peace in the region. And I don't know, I'm wondering if you want to say anything more about that and sort of the stakes of either the denialism in promoting kind of violence in the region right now versus the memory activism as a strand of peace activism in promoting prospects for peace in the region, how much that is happening or a possibility that you see. And I have like a related question, which I've also gotten from others in response to my work about sort of solidarity in the face of dehumanization during the wars. And I know you talk about like dehumanization and humanization in the books, but just how do you think of those kind of power dynamics and the fact that a lot of those presence of those kind of politicians and so on, those politics from the wars are sort of still present in government today. And so are these activists kind of leading to like a fundamental sort of destabilizing some fundamental power relations? And is that necessary, or how are they contributing to this element of sort of the dehumanization that happened during the wars and in the aftermath of that, given the fact that Serbia was really contributing to that kind of effect of dehumanizing other ethnic groups in the region?
Okay, I'll try to answer in the way I understand it's a question and a comment and a thought. I think I know you're also kind of grappling with these questions. I think so a few things here. I think thinking about the question whether memory activism can lead to sort of more the questions towards reconciliation or towards peace. I try to think about it carefully through some scholarly work in critical peace and conflict studies, which kind of sort of put forward this engagement with emancipatory peace, right, with the critique of the liberal peace. So that's I think that's something I elaborate on throughout the book, because if we enter this through the critique of the liberal peace, we then need to look for local agency, right, and sort of the bottom up and practices from below, and that's kind of, let's say, something that really allows the bridge between this kind of the study of the everyday piece, if you want, scholarly work, and memory activism for me. Also, to connect to what you started with, to the question of hope, and hope in activism, and hope in sort of civic action, and citizens who claim agency, right, and battle, sort of push back discourses of victimization. And it's not always that you are necessarily born to a family that is very liberal, or you grew up that way. This is kind of a process that I've seen that many of the activists have been through, to sort of come to the point that they engage critically with this past, and turn to think about hope in their actions, right? But that also, in placing it within memory studies more broadly, I think the field had started or began with much more focus, say, on war and trauma and violence, right? And so sort of, again, building on other scholarly work in memory studies that kind of approaches the cultural memories of nonviolence, for example, and the role of that in generating hope in societies was something I tried to sort of bring to that case study as well, where these kind of things I felt were understudied in some ways. And finally, the question about the acknowledgement and lack of, this is a space that politically still is governed by politics of denial, very much. And in that sense, sort of claiming through street action and other forms of action, acknowledging the past and acknowledging victims, but also through that sort of daring to claim also empathy, right? Empathy with the other, again, in a space which is lacking that empathy, even in the society itself, let alone with the victims of the wars. And by the way, with some of those who were sent to war in Serbia and came back and weren't taken care of by those who sent them to fight, and they came back themselves with their own traumas and their own issues to deal with, let alone the also loss of human life, right? So I think this question of empathy, I also take forward now to sort of continuing and looking at alternative commemorative events in other places, and to what extent this is difficult to bring forth and sort of engage with that publicly, and not being often being really blocked by those counter activists or counter protesters, let's say, who try to stop the appearance of these groups when they appear in the street, or when they invite people for artistic event or other forms of gatherings, right? So yeah, that's how I can think of what you've kind of your own questions about that.
Thank you, Orly. Related to the question about other contexts and other sort of movements around the world, which I also have been thinking about how we can connect this to other cases. Joe Eggers from the Center for Holocaust Genocide Studies asked a question. He says, I'm thinking about the parallels between this and other movements around the world, like Dakota activists here in the Midwest of the US that are confronting colonial institutions through art and public demonstrations, or in Germany, where Joe also went recently to learn about like colonial violence and commemorative actions around that, confronting the glorification of its colonial heroes. And the shift from commemoration to activism that seems to connect with subsequent generations. And he also said, if we look at Israel-Palestine, even, is it possible to see a third wave, I think, of that kind of activism or something? Does it continue to evolve? So yeah, kind of also like a nebulous question, but if you have any thoughts about connecting.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the examples Joe gave, and thank you for those, are probably can generate additional sort of empirical evidence to these sort of questions and frames that we're trying to unpack here tonight. I can add about the last one, because right now my current study looks at the two alternative commemorative events taking place in Israel among Israeli-Palestinian activists, the joint Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Day service, which used to be called the Alternative Memorial Day service, and also in the last 3 years, the joint Nakba Day commemorative event. And I'm trying to think about it very much. What they're doing is putting forward this acknowledgement as bringing them together to joint political action, right? And My point about these acts of alternative commemorative events and the claims of the activists and their practices and their tactics very much politicize those questions and put them at the center of other political struggles, right? And those two joint ceremonies that I've mentioned, also very interesting for me, deal with so it's not only the empathy and the acknowledgement, it's also the grievability, the recognition of the loss of life on both sides that has its right to grieve, but also the pain, because otherwise when we do dehumanize in many conflict, post-conflict societies, we also see this kind of hierarchies of the right to grieve and the right for acknowledgement of the victim. So that's sort of very interesting for me. I'll just add another thought that I'm currently trying to think about and develop, and that is that not all these activists will call themselves memory activists, right? So, for example, in the case of Serbia, definitely I think it has moved, the language of memory studies and memory activism has really been acknowledged here, and it's used by activists themselves. We can see that through the shift from, say, earlier is when activists here spoke much more the language of transitional justice, and now the memory studies is much more here as defining their actions, while I would say I wouldn't think that all the Israeli-Palestinian activists, when they do the joint commemorative events, necessarily see themselves as memory activists, right? Since it's still an ongoing and active conflict, right? And so I'm trying to think also in, comparatively speaking, in if we will put alternative commemorative events globally and try to compare them, we also have to think about sort of the post-conflict versus those that are still in ongoing situation of conflict, or as I would see it in the case of Israel-Palestine, more of occupation and even structures of apartheid, so in terms of power dynamics, etc.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful to point out those different historical and global contexts, even as we try to make these comparisons and connections between global cases. And there was one more question too from the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies about, just to mention it, just connecting to the region too, in comparison with these other groups like the Mothers of Srebrenica in Bosnia, and these other regional groups also that exist, but also have some differences and divergences, and also similarities and solidarity. So it's really great to hear more about that context. But I think we will wrap up because it's 2 p.m. our time and it's very late your time. I want to mention one more thing that for anyone who's affiliated with the University of Minnesota, Orly's book on this exact topic and much more in detail and really rich analysis is available online through the libraries for download for anybody who is affiliated. Otherwise, you can find the book online through the publisher, and that information is on this event page as well. So more opportunities to engage with Orly's work. And otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Orly, for spending the time to speak about your work and for joining us today. It was really insightful and helpful and interesting.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.